Now it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Danielle Allen is a scholar, activist, and changemaker who made history as the first Black woman ever to run for statewide office in Massachusetts. She's the James Bryant Conant Professor of Public Policy, Politics, and Ethics at Harvard University, and director of the Allen Lab for Renovating Democracy at Harvard's Kennedy School. She's a leader who brings people together across the political spectrum to work on making the world a better place. She's also the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant and the John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, which is an award that is similar in stature to kind of a Nobel Prize, so pretty cool. She's the author of several widely acclaimed books, expanding our understanding of American history and democracy. She's somebody who's been a great scholar, a truly superb scholar, who's also devoted time to trying to bring about real change in the world. And that's an extraordinary combination. And so we are very fortunate indeed to have her here with us today. So please join me in a very warm welcome for Dr. Danielle Allen.
Good morning, friends. It is, and I tromped right all over that, so maybe I should do that again. Good morning. Good morning. You are an amazing room of people. It is fantastic to see you here, and such an honor to be with you. I want to thank Dr. Charleston for the invitation and for his extraordinary leadership. Thank you so much for having me here. And Chancellor Mnookin, really, what powerful words. Thank you for your leadership voice. It is so important in these times. You're so fortunate to have Chancellor Mnookin at the helm of your university. It truly is special for me to be here with you this morning. Wisconsin has a deep place in my heart. My mom's an alum. She was a student in the 60s. She told me stories growing up about going to class through tear gas. So I know the complicated history of this university. And honestly, for myself, my theme today, how to be a confident pluralist, even with regard to that, UW has been a place of learning for me, and actually a source of hope. I was here 22 years ago now already, on September 11th. So I want to start by actually sharing that story, because I can't come to this campus without remembering that morning and what this campus gave me that morning. I was here to give a talk on things about ancient Greece. Feels very far removed from contemporary questions. So I was walking into campus after breakfast, and there was a street at the time as you came into the library that had lots of stands on it, selling knickknacks or food and whatnot. And as I got closer, I could see a crowd of people, and what's going on? It was like a whatever day of the week morning that it was. And I realized this crowd had gathered around one stall in particular because there was a radio hanging from the corner of the stall. And you have to remember, because we didn't have smartphones or anything of the kind back in 2001. And everybody was standing there just listening to the radio, reporting the news. The first tower had fallen. The second one hadn't fallen yet. So I reached then, after standing for a little while and trying to understand what was happening. I think we heard the Pentagon being hit too before I moved on. We had, of course, to sit and talk about what were we going to do. Were we going to continue with our planned event? We were supposed to have a seminar on Thucydides, the ancient historian of a war between ancient Athens and Sparta. And we decided in the end to go ahead and have that seminar. And the most extraordinary thing happened in that hour and a half or 2 hours that I and a couple other faculty and students had together. We came into that room with a profound sense of shock. We knew our country had been attacked. We didn't know by whom. We had no idea of what the scale was going to turn out to be. So we had the sense of war hanging in the air without much to get traction on what it meant. And it might seem like a very strange thing to have done, to then spend 2 hours thinking about ancient history. But what we found when we dug into this conversation about Thucydides, the story of the Athenians and the Spartans, was a path. You see, the Athenians, they had their moments of shock, as did the Spartans, and a terrible thing happened to them as they found themselves engaged in this war. They descended into civil war internally, among themselves. Stasis, it's called in the ancient Greek. Now, the word stasis is interesting because it means both maximal conflict and total paralysis. And that is what shock and the fear of war create for human beings. And as we dug into the text and thought about it, we came to realize, and because already we could tell some people were having a very defensive reaction, we must close our borders, we must consider who is among us, that wasn't what we wanted. That wasn't what we wanted. We came to understand that even in this moment of shock, this sense of paralysis, we wanted to stay true to what mattered most to us. And that was a culture of freedom, a culture of openness, a culture that puts human dignity at the center, that teaches the lesson of putting human dignity at the center by exhibiting it in every choice we make. We realized regardless of the pressures, we wanted to hold on to that. We didn't want to see happen in our country what we could see happening in ancient Athens. So I left that session that morning with real clarity about what mattered to me and why, and that I wanted to stand up for it, even in contexts where those values of openness, of commitment to human dignity might come under real pressure. So that's what this campus gave me. And I will be forever grateful for that particular lesson on that day. So this morning, I am in a sense here to give that lesson back to you again, because we are in another moment of shock and paralysis where questions of difference of perspective, difference of all kinds are to the fore, and we often feel like we can't see our way through. Or how do we bridge the difference? How do we turn our differences of perspective and experience and background into something productive? I want to share with you a picture of how to be a confident pluralist. That means I've got to define those two words, and I'll get there in a minute. Before I do, though, I want to dig a little deeper into what has brought me here, brought me to a place where the work I do is about democracy and what it takes to be a healthy democratic community. People often ask me, what do you work on, Danielle? You heard your combination of a professor and a democracy advocate. Well, what exactly is your focus? Can you focus, Danielle? Question I get. And it's very straightforward. Yes, I work on democracy, the past, the present, and the future thereof. And there's no question mark at the end of that for me. And it's important for me to share that focus, a focus on the question of what it means to be a healthy community where all are empowered, I come by that focus super honestly. I like to share it's a matter of my basic family inheritance. So on my dad's side, my granddad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in northern Florida in the 40s. Lynchings were on the rise, very dangerous moment. On my mom's side, my great-grandparents helped fight for women's right to vote. So my great-granddad was what you could call an early ally. He marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917. Then they moved out here to the Midwest, and my great-grandmother ended up as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 1930s. So I come from people who have loved and fought for democracy, who see empowerment as the bedrock for human thriving and well-being. There were also people who were often told that something was impossible, that social equality for African Americans in the South was impossible, or that women having the right to vote was unthinkable. And their answer to these kinds of comments was, no. Not only are these things thinkable, possible, they're necessary. And so the only question is how. That question of the necessary is really the question that brings us all here together today, this question of how we bridge the difference. It's a necessary thing to do, and so it is a question of how we do it. And growing up, I was lucky to be a part of a universe of super civically engaged people. They were engaged all across the political spectrum. Speaking of deliberation dinners, that's what my family was. There was this one crazy year in my youth, 1992, when my aunt was on the ballot in the Bay Area in California for the Peace and Freedom Party. So that's on the far left side of the political spectrum. And in the very same year, my dad was running for Senate from Southern California as a Reagan Republican. So we had the most amazing dinner table conversations. We were together all the time, and my dad was like skinny. He liked to wear a beret in the 70s. He was always smoking and with pipe smoke curled around his head. My aunt was a really big woman. She was built like a Mack truck. She had a huge belly laugh. She was gay. And they would go at it back and forth. And I was a young person, just like trying to figure out, which way does this thing go? My dad would make the case for market liberties and civic virtues. My aunt would be making the case for public sector investment across all segments of society and experiments in living. And as I watched them, I came to realize two things. For all of their debates, they actually had a shared purpose. That purpose they shared was that project of empowerment, that project of self-government for free and equal self-governing citizens, that project, in other words, of democracy. They were seeking empowerment for themselves, for their families, and their communities. And at the same time, they could debate ferociously on the how to get to that empowerment for all. The other thing I realized watching them was that, again, for all that they debated, they had each other's back, always. They never broke the bonds of love. It was clear that they would always hold sacred the human dignity of the person in front of them. And that was my basic lesson in democracy. They had clarity about what mattered to them and why. They were confident, both of them, in their views. But they also recognized that the other was equally confident, had also done the work of reflecting on what mattered to them and why, had important things to contribute. They needed to wrestle it out to come to some sort of accommodation, a way of being in space together. And by the way, while they did that, they were never, ever going to break the bonds of love. Ever. They were going to be there for each other regardless. That little picture, that story, is for me the best way of capturing what confident pluralism is. So let me go ahead and turn to that question of definition, and then the question of how. So, confident. That is about knowing what matters to you and why. The values that you carry with you and where they come from, what aspects of your background, your identity, your religion, your culture, your ethnicity, your affinity connections, your sexuality, what in your experience leads you to have the commitments that you do, understanding that all the way down. That's where confidence comes from. But what about pluralism? You can tell already that one of my basic themes is empowerment, the value to human beings of empowerment. Why is that my theme? My view is that the surest path to human flourishing is to support people in what we are all trying to do, chart our own course in life. Each of us is trying to make tomorrow better than yesterday. We seek to govern our own lives. We deserve the empowerment necessary to do that, to shape our lives. But of course, none of us is an island. I can shape my own life and my private life, yes, but I also live in a big community. My community is shaped by rules and norms, constraints that govern how we live together. So if I am going to be fully free, if I am going to be a person who's the author of my own life, then I also need to be a co-author with others of our common life, our shared life. And in being that co-author of our common life, I need to be a participant in democracy. That participation requires recognizing that just as I am shaping my own life in my private sphere, so is everybody else. And so freedom, a commitment to it, a commitment to empowerment, is a commitment to the beautiful array of lives that people can choose to build. My dad on the one hand, my aunt on the other. So pluralism, an embrace of it, a respect for it, comes from a very basic commitment to human empowerment, to human freedom, to democracy. So then, if that's what confident pluralism is, let's say a little bit more about where the challenges come in. So pluralism, then, is a necessary feature of democracy. By definition, we are a place where people disagree with each other. And that pluralism flows from the different choices we make of kinds of life. It flows from the fact that humanity is characterized by multiple kinds of intelligence. There are so many different kinds of thinking and feeling and being in the world that exist among us. So to focus on pluralism is to recognize that basic difference among us, among humans, and to respect and admire it and see its value. It's also to see the value that we get from bringing that richness of diversity together. There is reams of evidence in social science for the benefits to human beings, to communities, on dimensions of health and education and economic output, of being able to maximize the value of pluralism. But in order to do that, to bring the best out of pluralism, we have to support that feature of human existence with institutions that activate our pluralism in healthy ways. One of the most important set of institutions that's been invented to activate our pluralism in healthy ways is constitutional democracy. Constitutional democracy. It is a process for negotiating all of our diversity and coming to accommodations. It depends on a commitment to nonviolence as at the core of how we resolve our conflicts. Then there's another feature of constitutional democracy that has to be said out loud. The crazy thing about it, for all that we talk about democracy as being about the will of the people, the crazy thing about democracy is that what comes out the end of the decision-making pipeline never matches anything that any specific person wants. Never, by definition. We all put something in, and we all get something back that can never align perfectly with our own desires, our own picture of what's best. So the paradox is about pluralism that precisely because we respect one another, and in respecting one another, we are also respecting ourselves, we are endorsing our own empowerment. Precisely because of that, we also accept living in a society that will never mirror our own individual wills back to us perfectly. That is one of the hardest things to accept about pluralism, but it's a necessary thing. If you're committed to empowerment for all, then you're committed to that idea that the final social result will not perfectly mirror your own will. And that's the thing we need to feel and wrestle with. So let me turn to that now. So if that's to be confident is to know what matters to you and why, and if pluralism is about accepting both a project of empowerment for oneself, for all others, and then therefore the gap between one's own will and the social will, if that's what confident pluralism is, then how does one go about being a confident pluralist? So from the stories I've told, you'll have already heard or picked up the 5 key steps I want to name. The first is reflection. I shared with you the story of reflecting in that UW classroom about ancient Athens. I shared with you my personal reflections watching my father and my aunt debate the shape of our world. What matters to me and why? One of the most important purposes of a university campus is to give people the chance to engage with that question. I'm so thrilled by this convening because I know that it is letting you do that together and make space for that on campus. So reflection is step number 1. Ground one's own commitments. The second step is to commit to nonviolence and to the use of process to negotiate to accommodations that we can live with. I know that sounds kind of like a downer, Yeah, accommodations is that the best we can do, Danielle? Accommodations we can live with? Accommodations we can live with are the framework for freedom, all right? And we get there by negotiating together to accommodations we can live with. Commit to nonviolence, accept process. But remember, bring what matters to you and why to that process. To accept process is not to walk away from the substance of justice, but it is to commit to negotiating with others who have different pictures of the concept of justice. The fourth thing is compromise. This is really hard because compromise is a bad word in so many ways. We study our history, we read about the Great Compromise, the compromise that led to the durability and extension of enslavement for additional decades. How can compromise be a good thing? This is one of our hardest challenges. To answer this question, I'm actually going to take us to another part of our history that doesn't always register to people as being about diversity and inclusion, and yet it does have a story of diversity and inclusion in it. I'm going to take us to the Declaration of Independence. And I'm going to take us to the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence. And I want you to listen to it really closely. It has in it a really interesting, hard, but valuable lesson about compromise. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All right, you can be honest. Who remembered it was that long? Okay. It's a long sentence, and there's so much that can be said about it. But today, all I want to say about it are a few things about compromise. There are two compromises baked into that sentence, one good and one bad. So let's start with a good compromise. Created equal, endowed by their Creator. The Declaration went through many drafts. The first draft that Jefferson submitted did not actually have religious language in it. Jefferson himself was not particularly committed to Christianity, for example. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams made some edits. They added the created and creator language. Congress then added the phrases supreme judge and divine providence. But at the same time, the Declaration also talks about the laws of nature and nature's God. A double picture there, laws of nature and nature's God. What's going on with this language? All those words I named, created, creator, divine providence, judge, nature's law, the first set of words, none of them name any specific religious position, specific tradition, specific doctrine, none of them. And the idea of nature's law was about how to think about a moral code without thinking about a God. It was vocabulary for the people in the colonies at the time who were not believers. In other words, they worked their way to a compromise, language that could articulate a foundation for moral commitments for those who believed and for those who didn't believe. And for those who believed, they left the language open-ended, so that all traditions then active in the colonies were a part of the picture. That was a good compromise. Now, the bad compromise is the compromise around enslavement. And in this passage that I quoted, we actually hear the anti-enslavement moment in the Declaration. The anti-enslavement moment in the Declaration is the phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That phrase replaced what had been the convention at the time, life, liberty, and property. And the reason pursuit of happiness replaced property is because by the point in 1776, when the Declaration was drafted, the right of property had become the core of a defense of enslavement. And the committee that drafted the Declaration included two people who were against enslavement. John Adams never owned another human being. Benjamin Franklin had owned human beings earlier in his life and then repudiated that ownership. Okay? That phrase, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, is an anti-enslavement phrase in the Declaration. There is another moment in the Declaration, a passage that got cut out by Congress, where in the draft, there was a criticism of King George for continuing the slave trade and for violating the sacred rights of life and liberty of a people, distant people in Africa. Okay? Sacred rights of life and liberty of a distant people in Africa. That passage got cut out. That was the pro-enslavement moment in the Declaration. You following me? Okay. So, that anti-enslavement moment, John Adams, Ben Franklin, they used it to end enslavement in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania before the end of the Revolutionary War. It's important that people know that that voice is in the Declaration too, and not just Thomas Jefferson's voice, all right? But nonetheless, there's a compromise in that document around enslavement, the cutting out of the one passage, the maintaining of the other. What was wrong with that compromise? It did not take into account the views of all affected. Those who were enslaved in the colonies were not included in consideration of what the reasonable outcome would be at that particular point in time. And so there in the Declaration, we see two different kinds of compromise. One that brings all affected into the consideration, another that did not. And that's how we distinguish between good compromises and bad compromises. When you're wrestling with an issue on campus, in your community, are all those who are affected by whatever the shape of the decision going to be, are they actually included in the conversation? Are their concerns, what matters to them and why, a part of the picture of deliberation and consideration? So that was the third step, the hardest step on my list of how to be a confident pluralist, right, is compromise. Right? So we've got reflection, commit to nonviolence and process, and compromise. So 2 more steps to go. The fourth is how we talk to each other. And this one's really simple, and in some sense, the chancellor already spoke to this. We speak by listening first. The first question is always, have I heard you right? You said this, I think this is what you meant. Have I heard you right? And let your interlocutor tell you back whether you have heard them or not. And don't take the conversation forward until you're both sure you've actually heard each other. The truth is, when we stop to hear that way, we often find we haven't heard right. We often find that there is a value behind the thing the person's trying to say that we actually can see, we can recognize, we can see how that brings some value to the table. And then conversations become possible that weren't previously possible. The fifth step is never let anybody hold human dignity hostage. Never let anybody hold human dignity hostage. Now that can sound tough. Like what I'm saying is call people out. That's actually not what I'm saying. I'm saying something more like what Maya Angelou said in the quotation that we heard earlier. Never let anybody hold your human dignity hostage. However provocative they may be, your heart is bigger. Your heart has the space to recognize their human dignity, to communicate to them that you can hold human dignity first, even if that other person might not be doing so. And I want to conclude, bring these remarks toward their conclusion by sharing a story, a little bit of a story about what it means not to let other people hold human dignity, or you could call it not to hold civility hostage. I get an awful lot of incoming negative email and phone calls and voicemails left on my answering machine. It's like kind of astonishing. I'm a nice person, aren't I? You know, these people really don't seem to think so. And I'll say more in a minute about how it used to get me down. But for now, let me just say, I reached a point where I decided, you know what? I'm just not going to do this. I'm not going to participate in this universe. I'm not going to ignore it because it's a thing. It needs to be acknowledged and addressed, but I am not going to sink to that or participate in it. So I decided that for every nasty comment I got, by whatever medium, if it was in my power to respond back, that is to say if I knew who'd sent it or whatever, if I could respond back via email, for instance, or messages on Twitter, I would do so in the kindest and most gracious way I could. And then the most extraordinary thing happened. 9 times out of 10, the person would shift gears and come back nicely. 9 times out of 10, I kid you not. So let me just give you one most recent example, because people never believe me when I say this. So now I have to share examples. So this is an email I got on November 3rd. I'll leave the name out, of course, but a gentleman, I'll make up a name, we'll call him David. Aren't you ashamed to be associated with an institution that supports anti-Semitism and terrorism? I don't know how you can sleep at night. You are a despicable human being. This is ordinary. I'm not reading you the worst one by any stretch of the imagination. So I wrote back, "Dear David, thank you for your kind note. I wonder if you've taken the time to read my own contributions on the subject. If not, you'll find them here." And I shared a link. A few hours later, this one happened faster, too. This went faster than usual. "Dr. Allen, thank you for responding and sending me your writings on this subject. I found it very sensible and thoughtful, and I obviously was not well informed about your thoughts on this. These are indeed difficult times, and sometimes one should spend more time thinking and taking a deep breath before lashing out at someone. Please accept my apology. Thanks again for responding and educating me, David." Then me back again, because I never let them go. This has turned into a little project. "Dear David, thank you very much for taking the time to read my piece, for writing back again, and for your apology. You've made my day. It is my birthday, and this note is a great birthday present. With appreciation, Danielle." And then, "Dr. Allen, let me then wish you a very happy birthday and hope you do something very special for yourself. Even though I lashed out in hostility towards you, you turned the interaction into something very positive and taught me something about myself. I guess that's why you're a professor." If only everyone could do the same thing, we'd live in a better world. I hope at the very least I brought a little smile to your face on your special day. You're one of the lights you wrote about in your article. Thanks again, Danielle, and have a very happy birthday. All right? I mean, I did write him back again and said, thanks again, and with all best wishes and a smile. But at any rate, the point is just, wow. I mean, did we really believe that that's what was on the other side of all those toxic statements? And I've read you just one, so I know that leaves lots of skepticism, but honestly, this has become my routine experience. Again, it was surprising that after only the first email back, he apologized. It usually takes me 5 or 6 emails before I get an apology. But the truth is this, that simply saying, thank you for your kind note, made all the difference. Made all the difference. He knew there was a person on the other side who was going to hold his human dignity sacred. And that's where it starts. So this last point then about being a confident pluralist is that we can never let others hold human dignity hostage. It's hard. It takes all kind of self-control, psychological growth and development, but it's doable. And I do believe we're at a point in our own culture where we have no choice, really. Again, it's one of those necessaries. It's impossible to continue living with the toxicity we live with. It is therefore necessary to change that, and the only question is how. And I do know that a body of people such as yourselves, a force for good in the world, holding that commitment to human dignity sacred, and taking it with you even into the most contentious of interactions, you will help us all turn the tide. Thank you very much. This is the fun part. This is the best part. Oh, sorry.
Dr. Allen, I'm just going to swap. So do that. Thank you.
Perfect. So wonderful keynote, Dr. Allen. Should we give another round of applause for that? My name is Kelly Wu. I am part of the class of 2024 studying sociology and legal studies with certificates in French and criminal justice. I'm one of the DDEA interns this year, and I'm from Vancouver, BC.
And my name is Caleb Aguirre. I am a double major in psychology and philosophy. I'm a people scholar from the class of 2024.
Hold the mic closer.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you. I'm a people scholar from the class of 2025, and my pronouns are he, him. And so we will ask Dr. Allen a few questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you to ask questions as well. So please be sure to fill out the QR code to ask your questions at any time.
Okay, so let's just jump right into it. So in your keynote, you kind of mentioned this idea of disagreeing well with your compatriots. So in some cases, as we've seen, disagreements can kind of escalate and turn disrespectful. So how should we go about navigating those situations specifically?
I really appreciate the question, and I know that we're all in our daily lives navigating those moments where disagreements can turn really difficult. And I don't want to suggest, that it's all sort of as easy as that last email exchange that I read may have sounded. I do think that starting always by showing that you've heard the other person is the best chance one has of changing the dynamic into something productive. It does not always work, and one also absolutely and for sure needs to understand the boundaries of one's own safety. And so for any encounter that I have in a kind of contentious context, I always have not only that commitment to the human dignity of the other person, but I also do have real clarity about what my sources of safety are. Will I need to exit the space? Is there somebody else around who can be keeping an eye on what is underway? Do I have access to assistance if needed? So I think both of those things are an important part of it.
That's a wonderful point, Dr. Allen. So can you share an example from current events that you think really sort of embodies the essence of what it means to be a confident pluralist, and what sort of impact that event had on the community?
Terrific. Well, I will just take us into the immediate events and the war between Israel and Hamas and what that means on our campuses, and how we all are trying to engage and think about that. In my remarks, I said that one of the important things about being a confident pluralist is a commitment to negotiate to accommodations through a constitutional process, through a commitment to nonviolence. Now, the challenge with something like what we're watching on the globe is that none of us has direct access to those processes in regard to negotiating the outcome of that conflict. So on a college campus, what's the equivalent? I think the equivalent is, in fact, to contribute to and enter into a learning process. I think the campuses where we are seeing the most productive things happen are sort of like what I was just described earlier, when leaders from different perspectives, and interfaith leaders in particular, work together to set up learning conversations and environments for people. And people can bring different perspectives and points of view into that space and contribute to shared learning, with the goal of achieving a fuller understanding collectively. I think that would be an example of the kind of confident pluralism I'm talking about.
That's kind of a great transition into our next question, which is how can we kind of navigate that fine line between maintaining like our personal convictions and finding that common ground? Like, how should we go about that internally and externally?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So there are two things. Sort of one, that question about interpersonal interactions, and then there's the question about how the navigation works when we're talking about the larger universe of policy and concrete decisions and things like that. With regard to the first, I didn't spend time on the additional value or sort of virtue of habit and character of humility. I do think that in addition to knowing what matters to you and why, it's also really important to recognize that as human beings, we're all fallible. Every single one of us makes mistakes. And so I always am open to being corrected in my errors and want to hear in order to learn. So I think bringing not just that sort of clarity about one's own convictions, but that recognition of fallibility is really important. But then beyond that, it is also the case that decisions are taken, right? Congress decides things, or the Supreme Court makes decisions of various kinds, and they can obviously go against our own most deeply held commitments and convictions. And so what do you do in that context? For me, it is about recommitting to the process, to the work, making the case, building a bigger community of people who share my perspective and engaging in that democratic process. So that's, I think, one of the challenges, again, about democracy. What empowerment brings with it is sometimes the results do come out in the direction that you favor, but not always. And so life in a democracy is about a necessary blend of pride and joy and disappointment. There's never been a moment in a democracy where that has not been the case, which is a hard sort of idea to take on board. But
I think it's great that you bring up the recognition of infallibility, because I think many of us consider ourselves empathetic, but we may struggle to extend that empathy towards individuals with whom we strongly disagree. So our next question then is, how can we better do that?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. So there's a book I really enjoy. It will sound like a strange book for me to recommend. It's called Never Split the Difference, which after a person just made a sort of whole speech about compromise, that sort of probably sounds very strange. But what this book is, it was actually written by somebody who helped build the FBI's hostage negotiation program, who had to win hostages back in very adverse circumstances. And if you're trying to save hostages. You don't want to split the difference, right? Like, I don't want half a hostage, no. So what does that actually mean then? I mean, and it's an extraordinary book because it's actually about the most deep empathy you could possibly imagine. And it is really about sort of ways of communicating that are, first of all, that mirroring back. Here's what I heard you say. Really, trying to communicate that you've heard and find where you haven't and make those corrections. And then asking people a lot of how and what questions over and over again. How and what questions, which start to bring out what it is other people are actually really trying to do. Because at the end of the day, nobody really wants to be actually holding a hostage. Like, that's not the thing the person wants to be doing. There's something else, right, that they want to be doing. And so the question is, what can you then uncover as an alternative picture of what's possible for them? And then you put together, what you are seeking and what they are seeking, and you can find your pathway to a resolution. Again, I know that sounds unlikely or improbable, especially with the broader world of events that we're all watching unfold right now. But the point is that it really is, I think, possible. Not always. Like, laws get passed that never, you don't get unanimity in laws, so there's a majority and a minority on particular views. But I think it's possible more often than we realize to find a pathway that actually has brought into alignment, the things we care about and the things that other people care about.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point on kind of asking how and why questions and developing that dialogue. So that's kind of the end of our questions, but we can now turn to viewers' questions.
So the question then is, given the attacks on the DEI recently, and especially here in Wisconsin, how would you suggest we approach those who are not interested in engaging in a dialogue?
So I appreciate that. And, again, I think for me, this is where the kind of question of confidence comes in. You're doing good work, and you have confidence in your work. And so getting real clarity about why the work matters to you, right? What it is, what do I value and why, what matters to me and why. And equipping yourself to tell the story of what matters to you and why. And I really mean literally tell the story. I don't mean make the argument. I mean tell the story. Tell the life story that has brought you to your commitments and to your sense of why this work is so important. And tell your story over and over and over again. And empower other storytellers. The more stories you can tell, the better. So I think that's really important. At the same time, again, tell your story, but then ask the other person to tell their story. In other words, don't ask, say, I know you want me to get rid of all this DEI stuff, okay, but I already know that. Let's just put that over here for now. Tell me your story. Why do you care about this? What has happened in your experience that has made you think this is the right path? Let me understand. Collect those stories. And then consider where there are some learnings from those stories that might be assimilated into the work you're doing while you continue to make the case for the work you're doing. Continue to make the push for the work you're doing. That would be my recommendation.
So in building off of your idea of constantly collecting stories, someone asked, how do you not get personally affected by the toxic statements you get? Isn't it emotionally kind of traumatic to be on the receiving end of so many?
Thank you for that question. Well, yes, is the short answer to that question. But I want to tell another story about that. Because in fact, I had meant to include this story in my remarks because it will also give me the chance to say something else. I think that's important to understanding the environment that we live on, that we live in right now. So my first really serious exposure with that kind of incoming negativity came in the 2015-16 election cycle. So I'm a columnist for the Washington Post. I spent that whole year, starting in September 15, writing against Donald Trump. Okay, I won't hide my cards. Okay, I was not in favor of Donald Trump. Anyway, didn't surprise you exactly, probably, but. So no, but starting from September 2015, I was making the case that we had to take his candidacy seriously, that it was a serious candidacy, and we had to really, from my point of view, find an alternative. And I learned from that writing columns in the Washington Post doesn't make any difference. But the other thing I got from the process was just massive amounts of really horrible incoming stuff. So pictures of nooses and gas ovens and death threats on my voicemail and threats to my children and so forth. And it was affecting me. It was having a profound effect. It was making me afraid to go outside, like that concrete, because it was all anonymous. It's like, who are the people who hate me, right? Which of the faces on the street are the people who hate me? And I do not like and will not accept restrictions of my agency in that way. So I realized I had to do something about it. So for me, the first thing to do was to figure out where it was coming from. Like, I just couldn't deal with it as anonymous stuff. So I asked a friend who was an expert in sort of social media archaeology to kind of dig into it and try to figure out where it was all coming from. And he came in my office one day. He's like, Danielle, got some news for you. I was like, okay, yeah, tell me, what's the story here? I said, well, most of this is coming from Northern and Eastern Europe. And I was like, praise be. It's like, I can love my fellow Americans again. That is a really important thing to understand, okay? That it is not actually just us here in this country doing things to each other. We are genuinely subject to external actors, adversaries of this country, both nation states, and networks of advocates. So, it is Russia, it's Iran, it's China, and there is a global network of far-right extremists, and one of their key modes of action is to target people inside this country to encourage them into sort of extreme points of view. And they were in 15-16 targeting African-American public intellectuals because they were trying to sharpen the racial division in the country. And let me give you another concrete example to show you how intense this is, how important that we have awareness of it. One of my favorite artifacts from the 2016 election is a set of photos from the Houston Chronicle. And these photos represent protests on either side of the street, a protest and a counter-protest. The protest side, you've got people, right-wing protesters, who are protesting in their vocabulary what they call Islamofascism. And then across the street, counter-protesters are protesting Islamophobia. Their rhetoric is just as violent as the first group. They have a big banner with a picture of Hitler on it, and it says, "Follow your leader, kill yourselves." Okay? Really violent-looking protest photos. Both groups came out onto the street because of Russian Facebook groups. Okay? So I am sure that this is also happening now. I am sure that a lot of the conflict that we are seeing is being exacerbated by people who want to see us turn in on ourselves. Remember where I started my remarks, that story about Athens in the conflict with Sparta. What happened to Athens? It descended into civil war. That is how Sparta won the war. All right? Social media has given a lot of dangerous actors a lot of power. And we have to have awareness of that as a part of finding our way to our own positive culture.
So you're a very passionate advocate for democracy. So our next question here is, how do you navigate relationships with people who explicitly oppose structures like constitutional democracy and universal human rights?
Oh, that is a great question. It's so important. I really appreciate that question. So it can sound, when I talk about holding sacred human dignity and compromise, it can sound as if I'm saying, we should all get along, and the goal is for all of us to get along. And I will be honest, I do not think it is possible ultimately to ever get 100% of people on the side of commitment to universal inclusion, constitutional democracy, full rights for everybody, and so forth. And to some extent, we know that you can't get 100% there because the high water mark of support for constitutional democracy in the US earlier in the 20th century was about 70% of people considering it essential to live in democracy and adhering to those kind of core values. So at the end of the day, what we need is a cross-ideological supermajority that supports constitutional democracy, supports universal inclusion, full participation for everybody, and so forth. And so what you want to do, you have to try to de-radicalize the folks who have been radicalized. So that same sort of impact I was describing of social media, I mean, it has radicalized people in our country. And that's the thing we're not sort of self-aware enough about. But just as in other conflict situations, Rwanda, Northern Ireland, et cetera, there has to be work of de-radicalization. We actually need de-radicalization work in this country. You want to sort of do that work to try to shrink to the smallest percentage possible the number of people who are rejecting core norms of full inclusion, rule of law, nonviolence. Okay? So you never, ever turn your back on people who have made that mistake. They too have to respect their sacred human dignity, for sure, no question about it. You have to give them a way back, an invitation to commit to those norms of nonviolence, full inclusion, constitutional democracy, rule of law. But you also have to be clear-eyed that if they're not committing, then you have to have protections of safety, and you also have to be doing the work of de-radicalization. So that would be my suggestions.
So in that example, you mentioned human dignity. So someone specifically asked, can you expand on what a commitment to human dignity means and looks like in practice?
Sure. No, I appreciate that, and I realize the words expressed that way are abstract, and I'm trying to articulate a few different principles that apply in different contexts. So in interpersonal interactions, it's really what I was trying to exhibit in that email thread, right? Like, I'm going to answer with a big heart. I am not going to, diminish you, degrade you, demean you in any kind of way. Like, you may have just done that to me, but I'm not going to do it back. So I'm not going to fall into a pattern of revenge, right, or tit for tat or anything like that. I'm going to bring a kind and open heart, a belief that sort of charitability of intention, that you've got something that you need to say that just came out in a really bad way, and I'm going to call you back from that. I'm going to get you to a place where you can apologize for your bad behavior, and I'm also going to show you that the reason I'm doing this is because of my own commitment to human dignity. So that's sort of at the level of interpersonal interactions. At the level of policy, it is protection for basic rights, and of course we negotiate some of those, right? We're fighting over some of those reproductive freedoms, for example. We're currently fighting over whether those count as basic rights or not. So it's not a stable space, but nonetheless starting from the idea that there's a kind of commitment to basic rights, commitment to nonviolence, period. Commitment to nonviolence. And honestly, that means it even does not matter how serious the oppression. Does not matter. Violence is not justified. That's really hard. That's a hard one. But again, you got to look at the depths of tradition. Look at Dr. King, look at Gandhi, look at the power of nonviolence to overcome oppression. There is a path to overcome oppression, to overcome injustice through nonviolence. So that commitment to nonviolence is, for me, also core to human dignity. Laws of war, protecting civilians, also, for me, core commitment of respecting human dignity.
So you talked before a lot about asking how and why questions. So our next question here is, can you give some examples of the how and why questions you may recommend asking?
Sure. Makes me want to read another one of my email threads to you from another new friend. No, I mean it. Like, honestly, I do now. They become friends. I acquire friendships. So, sure. Let me think of a good example. Let me try if I can use the example that I just read out to you. Because that one, he sort of apologized so quickly. I didn't have a chance to use my how and what questions with him. So if somebody I have one particular conversational partner who really finds objectionable that I call attention to people in the 1770s and 80s who did have an anti-enslavement position and did have a commitment to equal rights. He will say something along the lines of, but none of the policies from the period protected African Americans or women, so, your point is just pointless, and you're a bad person, too. Yeah, it always goes with being a bad person as well. And so, I will sort of ask back, well, what do you think about, this statement by so-and-so condemning enslavement from this short period of time? So instead of, the point of the how and what questions, this is not a very good example, I realize, I'm sorry about that, but the point of the how and what questions is to avoid asking why questions. Why questions make people defensive. But if you use how and what questions, it actually gives them a chance to share more of their thinking. And then when they share more of their thinking, then you have more to mirror back. So I think, well, what do you think of this, anti-enslavement statement that James Otis made? I find this compelling. What do you think of it? And so then he would give me kind of a long answer back with what he thinks, and then I would have the chance to say, oh, it seems like you think that, words don't matter, or whatever. How did you come to think that words don't matter? Right? So we sort of kind of go on like that, basically. And then after a while, I'll say, oh, so you think words don't matter because of X. Well, here's my experience with why words matter, and I'll sort of share that back. And then it becomes a kind of dynamic conversation. And typically in my experience, again, I can reach a point where the individual is willing to say, oh, yeah, I hadn't seen it that way before. So.
Thinking kind of logistically, someone asks, how do we get in positions of power to advocate for those whose human dignity are consistently violated by laws, policies, and institutional practices?
Oh, I appreciate that question. I hear in the question, sort of a sense of, feeling not having access to power in a moment when the needs for more just action feel so profound and so urgent. And I think it's just really important to say we always do have power, more power than we realize. And the question is really to start by looking around oneself and kind of sort of map what one's opportunities are to make that kind of difference in the first place. So who are the people one can communicate with, can share a message with? Where are decisions being made where you do have an opportunity to provide input? Where can you see somebody making a mistake in the world immediately around you where you could help them reorient? And I am a big believer if we all can do that in our own, literally just map the relationships around us, a lot of good and impactful things come from that. And then, of course, the short answer to the question about being in an actual position with decision-making powers is just get old. I hate to say it, but it's actually age. Age just kind of does it to people over time. That is what it means to sort of pursue a career of any kind. You sort of over time, your range of influence grows, kind of by definition. So the question is really to learn how to use what is at your disposal well from the first point, so that as your access to impact grows, you are able to use it well.
So then our next question here is that you mentioned not excluding or rejecting people from society. So what are your thoughts on cancel culture, and what would you say a better solution would be?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So I am a big supporter of academic freedom and freedom of speech. I also always like to point out that those are two different things. I won't go into all the detail of that right now, but it is important to recognize that they are two different things. And so, I do think that, people make choices to bring speakers to campus. The fact that a given speaker comes does not mean that other people have to withhold judgment about the caliber of what is being offered. So from an academic freedom point of view, if what is being offered is bad, poorly reasoned, poor evidence, ridden with moral error, it's reasonable to say so. And there are all kinds of reasonable forums for saying those things in. One doesn't have to say those things aggressively or in any kind of violent way, but I think it is important to go ahead and say those things and to share that point of view. I do think that counter-programming is also important to making sure other perspectives are also heard. That said, as well, I am a real big believer in bridge building and relationships if people are sort of inviting speakers to campus whose views do seem to move beyond a commitment to universal inclusion or a commitment to nonviolence, I think it's actually really important to form a relationship with the people who are making those invitations, and again, try to understand what's motivating them, and try to bring their stories to the surface and figure out, is there any place where you can see a sort of shared kind of engagement to take forward. So I don't think that merely recognizing that one disagrees with somebody should be the end of the conversation. For me, it should be the beginning of the conversation, and there's a need to recognize that that's a place where there's a need for a connection so that there's more mutual understanding and the potential to yield different choices over time.
That's a great point. So our next question is, what are practices that kind of keep you on track in your work that you're passionate about?
Talking to you guys. No, seriously, talking to students. It's just, your perspective is so important. You can see things about our world that those of us who've been around for a spell don't have access to anymore. So we really need your voices. We really need what you can see that we can't see. So that is really, for me, one of the most important things.
All right, so our next question then is, could you describe the boundaries that you employ to allow yourself to not be overtaken by trigger points? So what kind of self-care practice to return to kindness?
Oh, no, that's really a lovely question. I appreciate that. So I will be honest, I am a person of prayer, so I pray. Prayer really matters a lot for me. If I'm feeling really beset by negativity and so forth, there's no question but that prayer is a thing that sees me to a better place. You don't have to be a prayer. You don't have to be a person of faith. I think being able to be meditative, that point about reflection that I started with, and knowing clearly what your own sources of strength are, is really important. So I would absolutely put that out there. I will also say that boxing lessons helped a lot. I kid you not. That's probably one of the most important things I did in my life. I had a great boxing coach named Heavy on the south side of Chicago. And Heavy taught me how to claim my own space. So that's the thing. I mean, again, that's the confident part of it. To be empathetic is not just to sort of give over to negativity, right? And I think, I hope you got from my email exchange that, I was going to get an apology. I was not going to be done until I got an apology. And I mean, luckily, that one, I got it in the second an email, okay? So that was, unusually quick, but I am not going to go until I get my apology. And so that's the claiming the space parts. I will absolutely empathize, but you are also going to own the wrong you did. You're going to name it. I'm not going to punish you for it, but you are going to take responsibility for it, for sure. And so that's the boxing side.
Kind of shifting gears a little bit, our next question asks, how can we help students navigate the hate they will hear during a presidential election cycle?
Oh gosh, that makes me so sad, that question. That makes me so sad. I know it's a good question. It's so important, but it also just breaks my heart. Breaks my heart. This was one of the things you heard I ran for governor in Massachusetts. And lots of people will often wonder, why is it that young people are so alienated from our democracy? The statistics are really incredible, actually, about young people not considering it essential to live in a democracy. And after just hearing so much from young people, I realized, it's a kind of very straightforward answer. You're born after September 11th. Your childhood is marked by the Great Recession. Then, you have this incredible rise of polarization in the 2016 election that just sort of takes polarization and all that hateful speech through the roof. Then you have a global pandemic, and by the way, you know, the climate is really going to hell in a handbasket. It's like, oh, right, okay. Of course, young people have a really challenging sense about what our world is like right now, and what we can do and be about it. And the toxicity of what our leaders do is just, it's really such an abdication of responsibility. And so it matters. It matters so much how leaders communicate norms. For me, a thing that matters is actually calling all of our elected officials back to their responsibility to set these norms of respecting human dignity, including in their speech, including how they interact with each other in Congress, for example. There is a project that is sponsored by the Carter and Ford Presidential Centers, which is called sort of Candidate Principles Pledge, and it sort of pledged that candidates should take, that they can take, that they will adhere to some of the basic norms of healthy democracy, basically. And Carter and Ford, because that's bipartisan, right? Carter Democrat, Ford Republican, so they're sort of doing this together. So I would encourage everybody in this room to check this out, the Carter Ford Center Candidate Principles Pledge, because I think we all need to call elected leaders back to norms that help us have a healthy culture. And that doesn't answer the question for how a person lives with it. I think the answer I have from the kind of question of experience is build the oasis with the people around you. You know, and on this campus, establish norms on this campus that kind of rhetoric, that kind of toxicity, they will not be part of the UW culture. They just will not be part of the UW culture. Build a counter space to what you're hearing, I would say. I think that's the best way of trying to deal with it.
Again, a wonderful point. So our next question then is, when groups attack or try to defund DEI, is attacking DEI their true focus, or is DEI a cover for trying to impose external controls on public institutions?
Oh, gosh. Well, you know, I mean, I think there is genuine, I think politics is always complicated, and there are many pretextual issues for sure. And it would be surprising if there weren't kind of pretextual issues in this case. But I think we also are having a real substantive debate about DEI questions and issues. And so I think it is important to hear that substance and take it seriously. I am a huge advocate of cross-ideological engagements and partnerships. I'm a huge advocate of including viewpoint diversity in work around diversity, education, and inclusion. I think we do need to do that. I think that it's correct to say that that's necessary. And again, you know, you heard me say, like, there's sort of a set of norms. You know, we need to ask people to, and then hold them accountable to committing to norms of full inclusion, universal participation, nonviolence. That also means, no, we do not insult each other with our words, okay? I mean, that's very straightforward aspect of respecting human dignity. So yes, there's sort of a bright line for the behavior that we're asking for, but the truth is there are a lot of people across a huge ideological spectrum who fit inside that bright line. And I do think a culture of belonging on a university campus does need to include that full spectrum and think through the question of how do we make space for conservative students to voice their opinions, to be engaged in productive debates and dialogues with others. And let me give you some reason to think that this is possible and productive. Often we take our kind of read of where we are as a culture from our national politics. And our national politics is a kind of picture of a country divided 49-49 with like this sort of little swing bit sort of in the middle. And it just seems like really riveted and really polarized. But that is not actually the full truth of who we are. A very different picture emerges if instead you look at state-level politics, and in particular state-level ballot propositions. And here there's a quite amazing thing that has been happening in recent years,
it is possible to get supermajority votes for ballot propositions. A supermajority vote means over 2/3. That means the people voting for it are spanning the political spectrum. And for some amazing things, like in Florida in 2018, a supermajority of voters in Florida voted to restore voting rights to people who had completed service of their felony convictions. In Mississippi, a supermajority of voters voted to get rid of the old emblems of the Confederacy on the state flag and replace it with new iconography. Supermajorities across the country have been voting for cannabis legalization. In Massachusetts, we had a supermajority, 70%, voting for what was called the sort of right to repair ballot proposition, which was giving small auto companies access to the data in cars so they could, or auto repair shops, so they could compete with big car companies. The point of all of these is if you look at these ballot propositions around the country, they show a picture, like supermajority of people, so conservatives as well as, we've seen some of this with some abortion decisions as well, right, who are saying, like, we're gonna stick up for the person getting the short end of the stick. We are committed to values of inclusion, to values of fairness, and the like. So the truth is, that is possible. It is possible to build that cross-ideological community of people committed to values of inclusion, committed to values of fairness, committed to values of belonging. And I do think taking that into the work for DDEA would be a valuable thing.
Yeah, so building on that, what are some resources that you personally recommend for those who are kind of new to doing this work and beginning their journey?
Oh, wow, that's a lovely question. Gosh, there's so many incredible resources. And I know, like, everybody in this room probably has an answer to that question. I kind of want to know, what was it that for each person in the room was the book you read or the experience you had or the person you spoke to who really opened your eyes to what was possible for us as human beings if we came together in our diversity, supported everybody, connected everybody, and generated that experience of belonging. I think for me, one of my really powerful early experiences was reading Ralph Ellison's novel Invisible Man. I was a graduate student at Harvard in the 90s, and I remember sitting on the sort of steps of this big white neoclassical building with sort of blinding sunshine coming down. And none of my classes were connecting to things I was living through. I had a beloved cousin who had just gotten arrested at the age of 15 and was sentenced on a first arrest for an attempted carjacking. A terrible thing to have done, but on that first arrest was sentenced to 12 years and 8 months from the age of 15. So that's kind of like what I was processing in my life. My classes were in a completely different place from that. And I found Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. I just remember sitting on the steps reading this and just feeling like my world was opening up. And this was what I needed to understand. And then sort of started to do the work of trying to bring that into my classes, into my academic work. So every single person in this room has an answer to that question of what's a great resource, but I hope everybody at some point has a chance to read Ralph Ellison's novel, Invisible Man.
So then our next question is, within free speech, we sometimes have people who say they don't believe in certain identities or related experiences. So how would you respond to that?
And so I guess I can't ask you what you mean because it's not actually your question, right? So I mean, it sounds like that's a question that is concerned about sexual identities. Is that, do you think, probably what that question is trying to ask about?
Can
you say the question again? Sorry.
So the question is, within free speech, we sometimes have people who say they don't believe in certain identities or related experiences.
Yeah. So I'm going to interpret that as being a question about sexual identities. If whoever asked, I apologize if I'm misinterpreting the question. That's how I'm hearing it, and I'm not here to ask you. I don't know who you were to say. Did I hear you right? I need you to tell me. But basically, so this is obviously one of the hardest questions that there is. And
oh, sorry to interrupt. We got, they just said any identity.
Oh, any identity. Okay, got it. Okay. Well, let me take the hardest case. Let me go ahead and take the hardest case. So what I always do when I am setting up my classroom is talk about the need to couple respect for academic freedom and freedom of speech with the responsibility that we all prove ourselves trustworthy to the others in the room. And proving ourselves trustworthy to the others in the room means taking seriously their own accounts of who they are. So I set that up as a norm. The point is that freedom of speech doesn't mean you say anything. There's still a moral responsibility that comes with our freedoms. And in my view, that moral responsibility is about proving ourselves trustworthy to others. And proving ourselves trustworthy to others requires respecting their human dignity, meaning not subjecting them to experiences of existential threat. So, if you have a view that somebody has an identity that you don't believe is an identity, then I think it's really important for you to give a lot of thought to the question of how can you articulate your view while also affirming that you respect and will protect the rights of that other individual. Okay, now that sounds like a kind of impossible puzzle to puzzle through, but I think that's the puzzle that one needs to puzzle through in order to be our moral responsibilities to prove ourselves trustworthy to the others who are in conversation with us. I hope that made some sense.
So our next question asks, what is your favorite question to ask people to extend the invitation for meaningful conversation?
Oh gosh, oh wow. Oh my gosh, you guys are asking so many hard questions. My favorite question to ask somebody to extend the opportunity for meaningful conversation. And so that sounds like a question that is about that bridge building across ideological divides, probably. And you're welcome to add an addendum if I have not heard your question correctly. Usually, at this point, I routinely build collaborations that bring people in across ideological lines. I've done that in doing work on the future of democracy, in doing work on COVID policy, in doing work on civic education. And what I always do is I call somebody and I introduce myself. I tell the story of what I care about and why. Often the story I told you guys about my great-grandparents, my granddad, my family, and things like that. I just share who I am so they can know what my values are, what I care about. And then I will typically say, based on the work of yours I've seen, I have the impression that you also care about X issue. I'd love to know more about your thoughts about it. It seems like it's a kind of urgent area for work. They'll share who they are, and I take the time to learn that first, to hear who they are, to listen to them. And then, having done that, after we've both been able to exchange the sort of what matters to me and why stories, then I'll say, look, I'm building a project. I think it's really important that it be a project that brings people with a lot of different points of view to the table together. We're not going to agree with each other, I imagine, on everything, but I really think we have to figure out how to do this work together. So I wonder whether you'd be willing to come to a first conversation to see what this work is. And then, I hope you might be willing to join our committee, our commission, our task force, whatever it might be. But, would love to have you come to that first conversation and see what you think. That's typically how it goes.
That's a wonderful answer, Dr. Allen.
It was very detailed.
So it seems like that's all the time we have for now. So
just
again,
in time, I was definitely gonna you guys were gonna do me in with your hard questions.
So,
thank you. That was really wonderful. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We appreciate your time and your insight.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. Please let's all give a big round of applause once more to Dr. Allen. That was so inspiring. She showed us that empowerment is the bedrock for human thriving and well-being, and that in order to be a confident pluralist, we have to know what matters to us and why. And sometimes that can be a very challenging question, right? Sometimes we haven't thought much about that, and we are often informed by what's happening around us. But what's important to us, right? And as we think about defining, and in order to sort of be a confident pluralist, we have to recognize, respect, admire the differences amongst humans, right? That's one of our largest challenges, and that's the essence of what this forum is about. That constitutional democracy piece was a little convicting, right? Understanding that the final social result will never mirror our own will exactly, right? If we take these things with us, I think it makes us better human beings and gives us an opportunity to really engage across difference so that doesn't become sort of cliche-ish, an opportunity to just have some talking points. But if we really want to see real progress as a human race, then we have to work together in these spaces. And then one of the key things that I take away also is that that we are co-authors with others in this common life, right? And that's folks that are in our family, our neighbors, right? The people we most vehemently disagree with, right? We're co-authors with others in this shared life. So thank you, Dr. Allen. I really appreciate that. So we're getting ready to transition a little bit. For those lucky 100 people who were here first, right? How many people were in 100 that got free books? All right, the rest of y'all what was y'all doing? There will be opportunities to purchase books, though. So they will receive a free copy of the latest book, Justice by Means of Democracy. Please go to Marquee Lounge down the hall, that way to the left. And if you would like Dr. Allen to sign your copy, she will be there to sign copies. I'm going to get my copy signed. So. Otherwise, I invite everyone to take a break and see us back here at 10:45 for the BIPOC student panel. Please don't miss that. It's going to discuss the theme of belonging. This topic is it's central theme of this year's forum, as you know, and indeed central to our goal of creating a more inclusive campus and society writ large. So take your break. Please be back promptly by 10:45. Thank you all.